The footsteps outside my tent. I've never told this story out loud before, mostly because every time I try, people either laugh it off or tell me my mind was playing tricks on me because of the cold. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and I know that whatever was outside my tent that night was not an animal. This happened during my winter break in December of 2019. I was 22 at the time, a college student who thought I was tougher and more prepared than I actually was. I'd always loved camping, especially in colder months when campsites were emptier and quieter. There's something about winter woods that feels untouched, like you're the only person left in the world. That feeling was exactly what I was chasing when I decided to go on a solo camping trip during Christmas holidays. I chose a state forest about 3 hours from my hometown, one that stayed open year-round. It wasn't completely remote. There were marked trails and a ranger station about 10 miles away, but during winter, almost no one camped there. When I arrived in the late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., the sky was already dim and heavy with clouds. Snow covered the ground in uneven patches, and the air smelled sharp and metallic, the way it does right before nightfall in winter. I parked my car at the designated lot and hiked about a mile into the woods to reach a primitive campsite I'd stayed at once before. It was tucked between tall pine trees, far from the main trail, and bordered by a frozen creek. The silence out there was intense, broken only by the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. By the time I finished setting up my tent, it was just after 6 p.m. Darkness came fast. I started a small fire, cooked some canned soup, and tried to relax. The temperature dropped quickly, sinking well below freezing. My breath puffed out in thick white clouds, and my fingers felt stiff even through my gloves. Still, everything felt normal, peaceful, even. The first strange thing happened around 9:40 p.m. I was sitting near the fire scrolling through my phone with barely any signal when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the snow. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. The sound was faint but distinct, a slow, deliberate crunch. Pause, crunch, again. I froze and listened. The sound stopped. Hello, I called out, feeling a little ridiculous. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No response. I stood up and scanned the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and low branches, but I didn't see anything moving. After a few seconds, I shrugged it off and told myself it was just wildlife. I went into my tent around 10:30 p.m., zipped everything shut, and crawled into my sleeping bag. That's when the woods went completely silent. No wind, no distant animal noises, not even the creaking trees. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every sound your own body makes. I could hear my heartbeat, slow but heavy, and the faint rustle of my sleeping bag as I shifted. Around 12:15 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. The crunch of snow was unmistakable, slow and steady, circling my campsite. I held my breath, listening. Whoever or whatever it was, wasn't rushing. The steps stopped just a few feet from my tent. I could see a shadow through the thin fabric, tall and narrow, standing completely still. My chest tightened, and my heart started pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. No answer. The shadow didn't move, but I heard breathing. Not an animal snorting or panting. This was slow, controlled breathing, human breathing. I sat there, frozen in fear, my hands sweating inside my gloves, despite the cold. I reached for my flashlight, but I was too scared to turn it on. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the shadow moved. The footsteps resumed, crunching away from the tent and fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, staring at the tent wall, listening for any sound. Around 2:30 a.m., I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The cold does strange things to your mind, I told myself. Fear fills in gaps. Then I heard a zipper. It was soft, careful, and unmistakable. The sound of a tent zipper being tested. My stomach dropped. My body went completely numb, like all the blood had drained from my limbs. The zipper moved maybe an inch, then stopped. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I felt trapped inside my own body, barely breathing. The zipper slid another inch. That's when I yelled, "Get the hell away from my tent." The zipper stopped instantly. I heard hurried footsteps, much faster this time, retreating through the snow. Branches snapped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, flashlight, and phone, burst out of the tent, and ran. I didn't bother packing anything. The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted through the trees, slipping on ice, my heart hammering in my ears. Every shadow looked like someone waiting to grab me. I reached my car around 3:05 a.m., hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked it, and drove away without looking back. I didn't report the incident. I didn't go back for my gear. Part of me didn't want to know what I might find. A week later, I got a call from a park ranger. They'd found my abandoned campsite. He asked if I'd been camping with someone else. When I said no, there was a pause on the line. He told me they found footprints around my tent. Bare footprints, no shoes. No boots. Just human feet circling my tent in the snow. They never figured out who it was, and neither did I. But every winter, when the air gets that same sharp metallic smell, I remember the sound of those footsteps, and I wonder how long that person had been watching me before I ever noticed. Someone was outside our cabin on Christmas night. I still associate the smell of pine and wood smoke with dread because of what happened that Christmas. Every year when December rolls around and the nights get longer, my mind goes back to that cabin, that silence, and the feeling that we were never truly alone out there. This happened on Christmas Eve in 2020. I was 24 at the time, working a warehouse job and using my Christmas break to get away from everything. A friend of mine, Ryan, suggested winter camping in a remote wooded area about 4 hours north of where we lived. It was advertised as a rustic Christmas retreat. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, just an old ranger cabin you could reserve during the holidays. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arrived on December 24th around 3:45 p.m. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered forest. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall fir trees that blocked most of the sky. It looked charming in a lonely postcard kind of way. Logs stacked neatly, smoke curling from a stone chimney, snow piled high on the roof. The temperature was brutal, somewhere around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The air stung my lungs every time I inhaled. Everything was quiet in that unsettling winter way, where sound feels swallowed by the snow. Even our boots crunching felt too loud. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like damp clothing that never fully dried. There were 2 narrow beds, a small table, and a fireplace. No cell signal, no radio, just us and the woods. Ryan joked, "Feels like the start of a horror movie," and laughed. I remember forcing a smile. We spent the early evening chopping wood and getting a fire going. By around 6:30 p.m., darkness had completely settled in. Outside the windows was nothing but blackness. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls that made the cabin feel smaller than it was. At around 8 p.m., while we were eating canned stew and instant coffee, we heard the first noise. It sounded like someone walking outside. At first it was faint, just the soft crunch of snow. I looked at Ryan expecting him to say something, but he kept eating like he hadn't noticed. "You hear that?" I asked. He paused, listening. The sound stopped. "Probably a deer," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. I tried to agree with him, but something felt off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. Later that night, around 10:15 p.m., we were sitting by the fire when we heard a knock. 3 slow taps on the cabin door. My heart jumped straight into my throat. Ryan stood up immediately. "Hello," he called out. No answer. He cracked the door open just a few inches, letting in a blast of freezing air. The porch was empty. Snow lay untouched, smooth and white. "No one there," he said, but his voice was quieter now. We shut the door and bolted it. The fire popped loudly, making us both flinch. I remember checking my watch constantly after that, like I was waiting for something bad to happen. Around midnight, Christmas officially arrived. That was when the scratching started. It came from the side of the cabin, slow and rhythmic like fingernails dragging lightly across wood. My skin prickled. I could feel my pulse in my ears. "Stop messing around," I whispered to Ryan, even though I knew it wasn't him. "I'm not doing anything," he said, eyes wide. The scratching moved along the wall, then stopped beneath the window next to my bed. The glass fogged slightly as if something warm had leaned close to it from outside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then a voice spoke. "Merry Christmas," it said softly. It was a man's voice, low and calm, almost gentle. That's what terrified me the most. There was no anger in it, no urgency, just certainty. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the window. The beam illuminated falling snow and tree trunks, but no person. "Who's out there?" he shouted, trying to sound brave. Silence. The rest of the night dragged on painfully slow. We kept the fire burning, sitting back to back, taking turns watching the door. Every creak of the cabin made my stomach twist. The cold seeped through the walls, numbing my fingers and toes, but I barely noticed. Fear kept me warm. Around 2:40 a.m. the door handle rattled. Not violently, just a slow twist, testing it. I felt tears sting my eyes. My hands were slick with sweat despite the freezing air. "It's locked," Ryan whispered. The handle stopped moving. Then footsteps retreated, crunching away into the woods. We didn't sleep. We waited for dawn, counting minutes. When the sky finally began to lighten around 6:50 a.m., I'd never felt more relief in my life. We packed our things quickly and left without eating breakfast. As we stepped outside, I noticed something near the window. Footprints. Bare footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping beneath each window. The toes were long, the impressions deep, as if the person had stood there for a long time. Ryan noticed them too. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We drove straight home. No music. No talking. A few days later, I looked up the cabin online. It was no longer available for booking. The page had been taken down completely. When I called the ranger station listed on the website, the woman on the phone sounded confused. "That cabin's been closed for years," she said. "Someone froze to death out there one Christmas. We don't rent it anymore." I still don't know who or what was outside that cabin on Christmas night. But every year when people talk about peaceful winter getaways and cozy cabins, I think about that calm voice in the dark and how it wished us a Merry Christmas like it already knew we wouldn't forget it. The caroler who wouldn't leave. I was 19 when this happened, and I had never been afraid of the woods before. I grew up camping with my family every winter break, and Christmas camping was kind of our thing. Snow, hot food over a fire, cheap decorations hung from branches. It always felt peaceful, normal. That's why what happened at Christmas still doesn't make sense to me, no matter how many times I replay it in my head. This took place on December 26, 2018, in a small national forest campground, about 2 hours from our town. My parents had gone back home early because of work, but I decided to stay an extra night alone. I wanted the quiet. The campground was technically still open, but nearly empty. I remember the ranger telling us, casually, "You might be the only one left after Christmas." At the time, that sounded perfect. By the time my parents drove off, it was around 4:10 p.m. The sun was already low, bleeding orange light through the bare trees. Snow covered the ground in thick, uneven layers, and the air smelled like pine and frozen dirt. I waved as their car disappeared down the road, then turned back to my tent, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. I kept myself busy setting up more firewood and cooking dinner. Around 6:30 p.m., darkness fell completely. The fire was my only source of light, its glow barely reaching the tree line. I hung a small string of battery-powered Christmas lights around my tent entrance, something I'd done every year. They blinked softly, red and green against the white snow. At around 8 p.m., I heard singing. At first, I thought it was coming from my phone. I checked it, nothing playing. The sound continued, faint but clear. A man's voice, slow and slightly off-key, singing a Christmas carol. I recognized it immediately. Silent Night. It was coming from somewhere in the woods. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to race. The voice sounded far away, muffled by trees, but it was unmistakably human. I told myself it had to be another camper, maybe someone hiking through late. Still, something about it felt wrong. There were no footsteps, just the singing, drifting through the trees like it didn't need a body to carry it. I called out, feeling stupid, the moment the word left my mouth. The singing stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, like the woods were holding their breath. I waited, listening, but nothing followed. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipped it shut, and turned off the lights. I was just starting to drift off when the singing started again. This time, it was closer. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. The voice was clearer now, each word distinct, the melody slow and deliberate. My chest tightened. Whoever it was sounded like they were standing just beyond the fire pit, right at the edge of the light. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening as the song continued all the way through to the end. Then came the clapping. 3 slow claps, spaced evenly apart. I sat up, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My mouth felt dry and my hands were shaking. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the tent wall, watching shadows dance as I moved. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The singing started again, same song, same calm tone. But now I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't singing the words correctly. Some lines were repeated. Others were skipped. It sounded like someone who'd heard the song before but didn't fully understand it. Around 1:15 a.m., I heard footsteps crunching in the snow. Slow steps, circling my campsite. I could see a shadow pass in front of the tent, tall and thin, stretching unnaturally across the fabric. "Go away," I said, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. Then the singing came from directly behind my tent, right next to my head. "Merry Christmas," the voice whispered. I screamed. The voice stopped instantly. Footsteps retreated, fast and uneven, crashing through brush and snow. I didn't wait. I shoved everything I could into my backpack, burst out of the tent, and ran to my car, slipping and falling more than once. The cold burned my lungs, but adrenaline carried me forward. I drove away around 2:05 a.m., hands locked tight on the steering wheel, eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone what happened until weeks later. When I did, my dad went quiet. He told me something he'd never mentioned before. Years earlier, a man had been removed from that same campground. He used to wander through campsites during the holidays, singing Christmas carols at night. He'd never hurt anyone, but no one ever figured out where he came from or where he went. They found his belongings once, never found him. I still love Christmas. I still love the snow. But whenever I hear Silent Night, I think about that calm, broken voice in the dark and how close it was to my tent when it wished me Merry Christmas.